This is the Aftermarket Radio Network.
Welcome, everyone, to yet another episode of Diagnosing the Aftermarket A to Z. I'm Matt Fonslow, and I have a guest. You're familiar with her, I think, and if you're not, you should be. We have a bit of a catalog building up, and I would hope you'd go check them out. It's Margaret Light, a marriage and family therapist, also the president/owner of Equilibrium Therapy Services. She is licensed for the state of Minnesota, correct?
That is correct.
And I would urge anyone seeking really to find your blind spots. I think too often counseling therapy gets pitched to people because, you know what, you're effed up. You need therapy. And honestly, a better angle, and even those who would like to give it a shot, I think a lot of it's just finding your blind spots. You just don't know yourself as well as you think you do.
Yeah, true. Thanks for having me back.
Well, we're going to quit while I'm ahead. Thanks for listening.
Done.
But before we get rolling too far, I'd like to thank our sponsor, NAPA Autotech Training. Let NAPA Autotech's Build-A-Tech program, like Build-A-Bear, help you turn your general technician into a moneymaker for your shop. Make them a profitable member of your team. Go to napaautotech.com for more details. So originally, Margaret and I were going to record an episode about, I guess, I don't really have a term, but the premise was going to be that I have a fair number of people reach out to me that are going through or have gone through a breakup and are very emotionally invested, and understandably so. But they seem to be making really big life decisions. And I just kind of wanted to talk to Margaret about that. But unfortunately, we have to change the topic because our profession, or better yet, one of our own, formerly one of our own, kind of committed, I guess there's no way around it, just a tragic, and honestly, I guess deplorable act. I guess we'll try to discuss like statistics and stuff like that about maybe the whys and why-fors, but he arrived at a decision, a big one, where he took the life of his wife and then himself. And we don't need to know who it is. Those of you that know. Those of you don't probably will find out. But really, to respect the family, I just don't want to worry about that, who it is, as much as what happened. And for those of us that are, I hate to say dealing with it, but on the outside looking in to try to process it. And then I think the next big thing is, as colleagues, friends, loved ones, put ourselves in the best position to maybe get some clues that something's not right and interject. And I don't know, do you find that to be unreasonable? I know it's rough. It's going back almost to the episode on suicide to pick up the red flags, but am I being unreasonable in just picking up maybe a couple of flags to just maybe say something?
No, I don't think that's unreasonable at all. And I think, right, what we're talking about is a profoundly violent act. And how do we compassionately and accurately talk about something that is just hard, right? That's hard to hold. And I think the question sort of everybody grapples with after something like this, what you're kind of hitting on without saying, is how do we make sense of this? And what do we do with it?
Yeah. And that's what I see a lot of online, is just trying to make sense of it. Some of it I disagree with completely, but I understand. I empathize with wanting to try to make sense of it, at least enough to maybe sleep at night. One of my early knee-jerk reactions or thoughts was that men kind of, I hate to use the word rules, but it seems there are vastly different expectations for men when it comes to emotions, especially big ones, versus, I guess, women. I'm not trying to put it us versus them, but it's really just men in general seem to be allowed to have maybe 2, 3 really big emotions. One of them's anger. We're allowed to have that. That's, we're not supposed to have that. But if they do, that's a very manly thing to do. That's a very masculine trait. Another one might be love to a certain degree, love for family, kids, dogs, stuff like that. After that, it starts to kind of fall apart. I mean, maybe fun, enjoyment, laughter, but you start getting into the world of fear and sorrow. Those rules don't necessarily play so well. And even for a really weak example is if I have a friend that's a woman, she's going through we'll just say a breakup because it's easy. And I walk in and she is just a bumbling mess, just tears everywhere, snot coming out of her nose, can't hardly form words, sobbing, just a mess that I would most likely just console her, grab the tissues, pat her on the back, hug, whatever, try to console. If I put that in, that's a man in there, male friend, and it's everything is the same now. Can hardly put together words, snot coming out of their nose, tears everywhere. All of a sudden, it's kind of like, here's the tissues. Do you need a minute? You want to go in the bathroom maybe and try to get your crap together? I'm not saying like I do that, but that's kind of the way society operates. And I'm not saying even men to men. Many women walk into that situation and there's a man in that condition and they do the same thing because it's like, oh, wow, I didn't know my friend was such a baby. And I thought because of that, there's a lot of bottled up emotions. And if there's a lot of sorrow, and I guess to go back to the situation that the events that prompted this episode, he kind of suggested that his wife was having an affair. And that was like a trigger or part of a trigger. I think, whatever. I'll let you handle this specific.
I'll handle that. Yeah.
But his wife was having an affair on him. And because he felt like he couldn't, or over the decades of his life, he was trained via environment, society, whatever, that he couldn't just curl up with a gallon of ice cream or a quart of ice cream and cry his eyes out and his world's different now. That it went to anger/rage, leading to the events where he ends up taking her life and then his own. I mean, that just seems like it makes so much sense.
Right. But it's not. When we talk about profoundly violent acts, I think that's a common misconception that, right, this is just like an emotion regulation problem or an emotion identification problem. And our research actually doesn't support that. Can that be a component? Is there an emotional thing happening there? Yes. And we can talk about that, but that's too simplistic. And when we look at kind of the research on the specific risk factors and prevalence rates, it's just way, way more complicated. And in some ways, I think way more difficult to talk about the things that actually tend to lead up to that, right? And we can't speak to kind of this specific scenario because we don't know. But if we're going to talk kind of generalities, how do people end up here? There's just a lot happening there.
As an aside, Friday afternoon, if you will, my wife and I went to a wedding, and I won't go into the details about the vows and everything that I've talked about before, the promises. At the reception dinner, you know, the matron of honor and the best man kind of give their speeches. And one of them, matron of honor, kind of made a joke. She's telling stories, childhood stories and observations of these two meeting and all that. She's like, hey, you two, look into each other's eyes. Know deeply. Look deeply into each other's eyes. Look deeply into your new wife's eyes. Look deeply into your new husband's eyes. Understand you are most likely looking into the eyes of the person that's going to murder you. The thing is,
that's true.
It's true.
Yeah. For
the woman. For the man, not so much. That's the real deal. I think this is important for us to talk about because 2% of our profession is made up of women. Probably maybe a little bit more now, but not significantly. It's well under 10%. Probably still under 5%. That means 95% of us men, our women they have reason to have some reservations. And I think that's why it's really, really important to talk about this, because not saying like I or anyone I know is capable of this, but I would have said that a couple days ago too, and bam.
Right. I do think that's part of the story here, and kind of what you were mentioning earlier about therapy kind of helping us notice our blind spots fits really well with this because, right, there's a story we tell ourselves about who we are, and then there's who we are and what we do. And for some of us, that's very congruent. And for some of us, it isn't. And I do think there is this kind of social thing that happens where we like to think that the people who do horrible, violent things aren't like us. They don't look like us. They don't talk like us. They don't live near us. We don't know them. And yet the reality of the scenarios is that they are, right? They're our neighbors. They're our friends. They're our coworkers. They're the guy on the bus next to us or whoever. And that's a really hard reality to hold because we don't want it to be true. And yet it is. And what does that mean? How does that kind of change how we think about the world or safety or each other or ourselves, right? How do we confront things that are really, really hard and that we don't want to be true and yet are?
When you say stuff like that, I suppose I do it when it's fitting, go to the extreme. I don't always like supporting arguments with extremes, but in this case, I feel like it fits. When you talk like that, it makes me think of people, if you will, or monsters like John Wayne Gacy. We're neighbors, friends, great guy. He's involved at the church, wonderful with kids, except he was burying a bunch under his house. Sometimes you just don't know.
Well, sometimes you don't know, and sometimes it's complicated, right? So that is an extreme example of people who did really, really violent things repeatedly to the nth degree. And the vast majority of people we know who are going to do quote unquote kind of despicable acts or things we can't imagine them doing, right? They're not serial killers, but I actually happen to know that, right, like domestic violence does happen in the automotive community. Sexual crimes do happen in the automotive community. And there's this thing that happens afterwards where I kind of watch the stories that get told or the things that get bought into, and it gets very black or white very quickly. This person was all good or all bad. They either couldn't have done it or they had to have done it. And there is no in between to kind of hold the complexities of a person who has maybe done some really wonderful things, but now there's something, and how do we square that with who we thought they were or who we knew them to be, right? And then you can kind of watch people flip back and forth between these two scenarios of, well, I'm done with him. He's out of my life. We're never talking again. And then, right, they get out of jail and now there's a story and an explanation and here's what quote unquote really happened. And, oh, I guess we can talk now because I like the story I've been told better. It was a misunderstanding. And it just perpetuates these discussions that don't actually lead us anywhere or don't lead us to a place of how do we address this and talk about this and try and prevent it from happening? Because I think the one thing we can all agree on is we don't want this to happen.
So what do we do? Just tell us. Make it make sense, please.
Okay, so let's start with numbers. When we kind of look at, because we're talking about murder-suicide or homicide-suicide in this right specific example, it's thankfully pretty uncommon. Kind of the most recent research says about 1,000 to 1,500 cases a year, which is rare and not as rare as we would like it to be. 91% of the people who commit these acts, otherwise known as perpetrators, are male. 97% of perpetrators are over the age of 19. So the vast majority of people are adults, and 77% of them are white.
So not to derail anything, I'm not trying to stick up for white people at all. Is that a lot to do with just the population proportion? Or is it, and it's probably not super important, but is it also a lot to do with just that race?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I don't know that. We'll look and see if we can find it.
It might be rough. The reality is that's when certain things happen, you kind of know it's going to be a white person, right? And I'm not trying to start up anything, but that's just the reality. There's certain crimes that when you hear about it, kind of know.
It is a solid question, though. One of the things I ran across when I was sort of researching this to pull specific numbers is there's not actually a ton of data. And part of it is because, right, when we look at this compared to other violent crimes, this is less common. And this is a very specific sect of crime, right? We kind of filter down from like, right, what percentage of suicides involve murder, what percentage of homicides involve suicide, and then when you mix DV in there, which we're going to talk about in a minute, right, this is this really specific thing. And even in the research, there's kind of some debate about how do we even classify this, or is this its own thing? So it is messy in that way.
It's messy too because the best people to ask are dead.
Correct. Right. Well, and here's the other piece of it. So when you look at your victims, 69 to 77%, so again, right, we have some inconsistency in the numbers, of victims are current or former female partners. 1 in 4 cases involve multiple victims. And of those cases involving multiple victims, about 11% involve children under the age of 18. Yeah, that's a rough one.
Yeah, that's rough.
81% of these occur in the home, and 88 to 92% of them are done with a firearm. And people who've listened to the suicide episode know there's a thing with firearms when we talk about suicide. And it is also present here where there's a study I'll talk about a little later where they actually went back and interviewed men who murdered their partners or spouses and then not themselves. And one of the questions they asked those participants was, if a gun had not been in the home, would you have found another weapon to do this with? And the overwhelming answer was no.
Really?
Yes. Now, you're dealing with self-report, so like take that for what you will. But there is something there about firearms in that they are efficient. They allow you to be impulsive, right? They're quick and they're lethal. You are less likely to survive that attack.
Yeah. And it's very easy to go from, I guess, fear-inducing control to now lethal. Yeah. And you don't have to be in super close proximity. So I think somebody might take this as being very anti-firearm. It's not, but I think we can accept that they do that job extremely well. And in the hands of the wrong person at the wrong time, destructive. Like many things, but you can't ignore it.
Right, correct, right? I'm a firearms owner. This isn't anti-gun. This is just the facts. The fact is, this is what happens. The other piece of this that's going to be distressing is the majority of homicide suicides are premeditated. So when we talk about emotion regulation, I think the other half of that assumption is that this was super, super impulsive and it was done in like the heat of the moment. And it's possible that happened, but it is more likely that there was some type of premeditation. Now, when we talk about premeditation, what our research kind of talks about is somebody may or may not have had a set like, I am going to do this on this date to this person for X reason, but it might have been something they sort of entertained or fantasized about previously or rehearsed in their mind. Or when we talk about firearms, when we talk about domestic violence, firearms are frequently used to terrorize, threaten, or intimidate. And so there's this kind of, for lack of a better word, rehearsal aspect of how does this person I'm terrorizing respond when I start waving a gun around or when I threaten to kill myself or when I hold it up to their head. And that's something that happens in domestic violence. That sort of gives you some stats on, right, who's doing this, who are the victims, what does it kind of look like? The reason we keep bringing up domestic violence is when we look at the research, the number one predictor of a homicide suicide is domestic violence. That doesn't mean it's every case, but that does mean it's our number one risk factor. And here's the part where DV gets really messy is, again, right, our numbers, it's a range, 25 to 39% of homicide suicides involve previous police reports for domestic violence. Now, that's what's been reported.
What hasn't been reported?
Correct. So I have a number for that because one study actually did that. Like when you go talk to friends and family and you don't rely on police reports, what do you get to? Well, then the number increases to like just over 70%.
Wow. That's mind-blowing.
It is. And there is something very upsetting about that. And, right, this is the other piece about domestic violence is what gets reported even by friends and families varies depending on what type of domestic violence we're talking about. So usually when I say domestic violence, what people kind of picture is the like kind of classic coercive controlling, right? It's a male perpetrator, a female victim. She's not allowed to have a job or have money, or he controls access to the kids or the keys to the car. And then, right, he beats her or hits her or something like that. The unfortunate thing about that is not the majority of domestic violence cases. Domestic violence can be a lot more insidious and a lot more subtle than that. So we're also talking about types of sexual abuse. The vast majority of survivors of kind of sexually based domestic violence do not share with friends and family until well after that relationship is over. So you're not going to know. Or we're talking about psychological abuse or threats. When we look at the research on psychologically based DV, the prevalence rate in women and men actually is just under 50% of people experience it at some point in their life. It sits around 48%.
That's a little stomach churning.
And again, that stuff typically is not recognized as domestic violence. We might recognize it as bad behavior, but we're not going to call it DV. And so when we kind of take all that into account, some research indicates that when we look at homicide, suicide cases, the prevalence rate of DV is actually closer to 92%.
But that seems to track, right? You know, future behavior kind of predictable or predicted from past behavior.
Correct. And so, right, exactly. When we look at that, when we sort of look at the risk of violence, right, if we're doing a violence risk assessment, that's one of the number one things we look at is what is the past predictors of this? What type of behavior have we seen in the past? And when we're looking at domestic violence, there is kind of some knowledge out there of what is our number one indicator that someone is going to be killed by their spouse in the DV world? And the answer is strangulation. If there is a history of strangulation, that is our number one risk factor that there will be a homicide in that family. Is it a guarantee? No, but it's significantly higher than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff you talk about, it's just probabilities, and you start stacking them, and yeah, you just end up in a really, really bad zone, if you will, of something really awful happening. And don't get me wrong, like a lot of that stuff leading up to it is truly awful.
Right, exactly. And so then, right, then we add to it. Okay, so we have this DV component. The other thing that really stood out is, right, the other thing that kind of gets talked about after violent acts is mental illness. This person was mentally ill. And that gets really complicated. As someone who works, right, with folks with mental illness, and we work on mental health, because usually where the conversation ends then is, oh, well, we just need to increase access to mental health resources or, right, therapists. Which, like, hey, as a therapist, I think that would be great. That will not solve this problem in and of itself, though. And there's this sort of loaded piece of when we look at violence as a whole, mental illness does not explain why that's happening. There is a piece we can't ignore, though, when it comes to homicide, suicide, which is roughly 62 to 66% of perpetrators who are primarily male do have a previous mental health diagnosis. The two most common were depression or psychosis.
A few episodes ago, we brought up depression oftentimes manifests itself in rage or big anger emotions.
Right. And we're going to talk a little later about kind of like some of the distorted thinking that can happen in these cases. And we can kind of link that to if you have a man with untreated long-term depression, what kind of thoughts could be happening there? And again, it's not a universal, but we can actually track that a little bit. The piece that stands out is I think a lot of us would like to believe that psychosis explains that this happens. And actually, psychosis is one of the less frequent between depression and psychosis. When we look at psychosis, that's present in maybe 11% of cases where there's a mental health history. So that doesn't explain it either.
When you say psychosis, are we talking somewhat like psychopaths?
No. When I say psychosis, I'm talking about someone who is delusional or hallucinating or has otherwise lost touch with reality. They believe that like their spouse is reporting on them to the FBI and they're the victim of a government conspiracy and this is the only way to save the face of the planet is to kill my spouse. And I'm glad you brought that up. 62 to 66% have a previous mental health diagnosis. Most of the time that's depression, followed by psychosis. And then we don't have numbers on this, but sort of the field suspects the rest of it, or the rest of the percentage of mental health diagnoses is made up by personality disorders. So when we talk about psychopaths, if you read the DSM, which is our trusty little like book of mental health diagnoses, usually what people are referring to there is antisocial personality disorder. There's other mental health diagnoses there as well, but that's the one people tend to think of. But that's pretty rare. It's like 1% of the general populace, if I'm remembering my numbers correctly.
Yeah, and they're usually nonviolent.
Correct. And they are usually nonviolent. The vast majority of people with antisocial personality disorder are not violent. They might be difficult, or they might do some kind of like bad behavior things, but right, most are not violent. They actually, just a small sidebar, when we look at the rates of like CEOs and high up officials, they are disproportionately represented with antisocial personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder. So just a sidebar.
And that tracks.
It does. And they're not necessarily your average Joes. With that being said, though, men with depression actually have a threefold increase in committing some type of domestic violence act. So there is a thing there with depression. And of these people who have committed these violent acts, right, who have this mental health diagnosis, less than 12% ever met with a mental health professional in their life. So what we're talking about is untreated, right? Maybe it was diagnosed, maybe not, probably untreated. We're also talking about roughly 25% of perpetrators had between 1 and 4 previous suicide attempts. And 26% had previous episodes of self-harm. So that's cutting, burning, bruising, things like that. We're also talking about, and I don't have a number for this, drug and alcohol use can be a pretty big risk factor, especially when we're talking about impulse control. But again, that is not as high as domestic violence or this sort of depression thing that is untreated. And I do think it's important to highlight a lot of these people were diagnosed and they chose to be untreated. Or they couldn't access, but kind of in my experience, it tends to be the kind of the chose direction, which is tough, but here we are.
A lot of stigmas.
A lot of stigmas. And when we talk about men with depression who are maybe presenting with rage, that tends to be a very externalizing behavior. And when we look at the research on who accesses mental health services, people with internalizing behaviors tend to be the ones who access mental health services because internalizing behaviors create a lot of distress for the person experiencing them. People with externalizing behaviors are actually a lot less likely to seek treatment because the people who are distressed by their behavior are less likely to be them and more likely to be the people around them. And then you can kind of get into that power struggle of you need to go to therapy. No, I don't. And so there's just like a sticky thing there of, do they need it? Sure. But they aren't buying.
You could make a strong argument that I hesitate to use the word needs, but needs, I think we could use that. Everybody could really use some time talking to somebody that really is paid to look out for them and is on the outside, not involved, of course, trained, of course. And like I said, pointing out blind spots, but also I think just helping you with tool sets and toolkits, letting you process a lot of different things. Like it's almost endless.
Well, and sometimes it's about, especially for people with externalizing behaviors, can we make life go better for you? And do you have any ability to affect that change? So you may not think you have a problem, but maybe you don't like fighting with your spouse, or maybe you don't like getting in trouble at work, or maybe you feel like people kind of don't like you or are jealous of you. Okay, Can you change anything to make your life easier for yourself?
NAPA Autotech training sessions are being conducted day and night in a town near you. This training caters to every level within your organization, be it a mechanical assistant, a mechanical specialist, a technology specialist, or a driver safety calibration specialist. Imagine a one-stop shop training partner in NAPA Autotech that will lead your team to a path to greatness. Autotech's entry-level Build-A-Tech classes convert the untapped potential of your new hires into money-making mechanical specialists. Autotech's higher-level tech update classes introduce specialists to the world of ever-changing technologies, which prevents your shop from getting technologically stagnant. Remember, if you're not moving forward, you're falling behind. And, turning to the front of the store, the Autotech Service Advisor class is an awesome way to hone your client advocate skill set, ultimately benefiting the customer through an improved vehicle repair experience. But it doesn't stop there. Imagine an electric vehicle class that takes your specialist well past the mundane, yet necessary safety topics. Well, it's here. Autotech's EV Ready training is a week-long curriculum that takes participants through a hands-on experience involving hybrids and electric vehicles. The session kicks off with the use of PPE and proper tooling while touching on required OSHA regulations. Then, the students dive into the lab vehicles to gain knowledge of the common high-voltage components on EV and hybrid vehicles and their function. Attendees will be taken on a path exposing them to different electric vehicle manufacturers to compare component form and location. Additionally, information about Level 1 and Level 2 charging systems will be included, along with a quick look at DC to DC charging. The operation and maintenance of subsystems are explored, including the different modes of Tesla operations, and so much more. So what are you waiting for? Commit to taking your business to the next level with NAPA Autotech training. I will take something a little bit from the substance use world, that's where I got a lot of my quote unquote education. I don't have a substance use disorder, but my wife does, and she is in that world. And that's where I spent a lot of my crash course time trying to learn about, is that, like it or not, we're kind of flesh big computers and we're running programs. And we got that data set from a little bit what we were born with, instinctual, mostly by our environments. So we're all running programs. If you're not working a program, which doesn't necessarily mean like 12-step, but it could be working with a professional, a counselor, a therapist, something like that, where now you have some new programming, a new programming to run, a new toolkit to use. If you're not running or working a program, your programming will work you. That's the reality. That's the sales pitch to just, you're not broken, you're not effed up, but sometimes you just need a little bit of tweaking of the old programming, or just someone to go through it and debug it a little bit and go, nah, it looks pretty good.
Right. Yeah. Double check. Very true. And, right. Okay. So let's talk about these other risk factors. Real or perceived infidelity. That's pretty important, especially when we talk about DV, is kind of the perceptions around infidelity can get pretty complicated and skewed. Sometimes it's like there's a belief there's been infidelity. It's up for debate if that's actually happened. Financial problems or job loss. When we talk about that risk factor, it is only a risk factor in the research when it is combined with domestic violence. So if we're talking about a situation where there isn't domestic violence and there's financial stress or job loss, it actually doesn't look like a risk factor anymore.
I guess that can make sense, right?
I mean, it's what our current research says. Stepchild in the home or estrangement from the child seems to be a risk factor. Like there's more tension in those households and there's an increased risk of homicide, suicide there. It's not totally clear to me why, but that was an identified risk factor. Imminent separation or custody disputes. We actually know that's a huge risk factor for violence in domestic violence scenarios and just more broadly. And then we get into, I'm going to call these kind of like the characteristics or the emotional components of this. Personality characteristics or emotional components. So desire for and sense of entitlement to control. When we talk about control, I think this is where it can get really sticky because, again, we tend to think of that very stereotypical, like you're not allowed to have a job, you're not allowed to have friends, you're not allowed to see your family, you're not allowed to have access to the bank account. That is all very controlling. But control can also be more subtle in a, well, I'm not going to tell you you can't see your friends, but I am going to interrogate you for 30 minutes when you get home. Or I'm going to track your phone without your consent, and if you turn it off, I'm going to yell at you about what the F are you doing that you don't let me see. Or, right, I heard you were at the bar last night talking to so-and-so. I knew you were always cheating on me, right? Like, there are these other components to it that are tougher to nail down that we might call just bad behavior, but is actually control. And we also get into kind of explosive anger then, right? If you're having a fight with your spouse and you start breaking things, how much of that is because you want a certain response or because you want them to back down or take you seriously? Like now you're trying to, it's this inadvertent sort of roundabout way of, I don't feel like I'm being listened to, so I get bigger and bigger and bigger to force you to listen to me. That's control.
Bigger, bigger, louder, louder.
Right. There are other ways to get someone to listen to you that doesn't involve that. So that's a component. Attempts by the victim to leave the relationship. When we look at DV outside of strangulation, what we know is one of the riskiest times for someone kind of in that scenario is when they are attempting to leave. And when we think about kind of mixing this in a messy way, right? Imagine the scenario of, let's say we have someone with like long-term kind of untreated depression. Let's say there's been some psychological DV. Let's say there's a fight where there's some perceived infidelity and there's some additional stressors and somebody like, right, a victim says, fuck this, I'm done. Right? Our scenario suddenly looks really explosive. And so when we talk about kind of attempts to leave or threats to leave, have they actually taken steps towards that? Have they not? And when we look at domestic violence scenarios, or is somebody just getting the sense that they might? Right? Is there just a belief there that may or may not be based in reality? Then there's this piece of, we call it emotional instability and overdependence on the victim. So we have someone who is emotionally labile, so kind of all over the place or unpredictable or maybe intense. Could be a word that might be thrown around about someone like this. But then their identity hinges on their relationship to the victim and the victim behaving in a way that they find acceptable.
My wife and kids are everything to me. They're part of my identity.
Correct. It's not like a cutesy everything of like I go to work every day for them and gave up my motorcycle because like I'm responsible, right? Not saying people need to give up their motorcycle. But it's that extreme. They are everything to me. If I lost them, I would kill myself. And I have heard people say this.
Same with some like business owners. Their business becomes part of their identity.
Correct. Right. And then sometimes what happens there is that can kind of progress to this place of there is no longer a boundary between me, my spouse, and my children. If you behave badly, it reflects poorly on me and I cannot tolerate that. So I need to force you to stop whatever you're doing that I'm uncomfortable with. Or it can kind of be this like, well, they're my possession. You do what I say because I said so. Right? So there's this enmeshment there that can get pretty dangerous.
Yeah. And when something becomes a possession in your mind and they don't follow your script, that seems like that leads to the knee-jerk leads to jealousy.
Right. Yeah, very much so. Jealousy, and it's dehumanizing, right? This is no longer a person I can hurt. They're no longer an autonomous being. They no longer have a right to have a life without me. They're less than human.
That's a really good point. Wow. This is why I like these. Like sometimes you say stuff like that and it's almost like doors opening. Like, wow.
Right. Well, right. There's something really to that, right? Of like, I can destroy a possession and it's fine. I can be justified in doing so. It is my property. I get to do that.
I wouldn't have got there. The dehumanizing aspect, once you said it, just, oh, yeah. Wow.
So again, right, we can kind of start to see we're piling in all these things, right? And some of them are loud and some of them are subtle. And we don't necessarily think to look.
Who would?
Well, correct. Right. Who would? That isn't how we like to think about people or the world.
I'm thinking even in real life scenarios where we'll be somewhere in a social setting, a party, a gathering of multiple people, namely couples. And you've got the husband and wife where somebody engages with the wife in an innocent conversation, or even just maybe whoever's talking to her is technically flirting with her, but she's not really returning it. But the husband sees that, and the next thing you know is kind of escorting her away. And I'm not saying like he's just got her by the arm and is squeezing and her hands turning purple, but there's tension. Even in those situations, now that's a major red flag. And for me, I see that. That's not okay. And I'm not going over there to just like break it up. Don't you do that. But it's like, hey man, are you all right? What's going on? That looked a little tense there. Well, I didn't appreciate the way he was talking to her. Okay, but you escorted her away. And I'm not trying to sound like I'm freaking trying to counsel the guy. But when you see that, I guess, and I'm not trying to direct this too fast away from where you were going, but I guess maybe to pin this a little bit later, in that situation, what would be a protocol? Whether engaging him, or do I kind of need to get to her? And is there a way to ask? And is it somewhat like the substance use world where if you think somebody's using, usually the best way to ask is just flat out like, hey, you using? You drinking? Like it sounds coarse, or like the suicide episode, right? Like straight up, it's like, hey, have you had thoughts of hurting yourself, killing yourself, stuff like that? If we want to pin that so you can keep going where you're going.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I do want to talk about it, but let's pin it because it's going to make sense in a few. Okay, so kind of the next sort of personality or emotional thing we add on here is a lack of resilience and an inability to cope with stressful events, evidenced by previous violence towards self or others. So we're talking about people who get stressed and lash out, either at themselves or at other people. So I think a lot of times, let's start with self-harm or suicide first. I think a lot of times we picture that as this very hopeless place, right? People are doing this because they're hopeless. And that certainly, right, represents a major sort of population of people who experience self-harm or suicide. But there's also this other flavor to it that can be a bit more self-destructive or angry. I'm angry, so I cut myself. I'm angry, so I put my fist through a wall. I'm angry, so I threw things at my spouse. That would be evidence of a lack of resilience and an inability to cope, demonstrated by this kind of violent behavior, right? And that can also be then, bar fights in the right context, or previous episodes of domestic violence, or, fist fights. Right. And we need to understand the context of those to understand why is that being done? Is the context done in this sort of like stressful, angry way? Right. True self-defense would not be evidence of this, but explosive rage caused by stress would. So that's a component of this. And kind of as expected, access to firearms. That's an automatic risk factor. And actually, some of our research says women living with a gun in the home are 3 times more likely to be murdered than a woman without a gun in the home.
Yeah. And by the cohabitant.
Correct. Yes, it is most likely to be someone living in the home with you. Right. Exactly. And there's actually some research that says, and here's the language of it, hostile gun displays against family members may be more common than using a gun in self-defense. So again, right, when we're talking about, and we'll kind of get to this, if we're kind of asking people about home scenarios, just like in the suicide episode, if we suspect violence in a home, we want to know if there's a firearm in the home, just because increased risk. So then we get to age. And there's a little bit of research out there that kind of breaks down based on age, what types of emotions tend to be present.
That's intriguing.
Right. Yeah. I didn't know that existed. I didn't know we had gotten that far. But here it is. Ages 20 to 35, you're more likely to see controlling and possessive, if not blatantly abusive. And then the entire sense of self is dependent on the relationship, and there's likely to be a lot of sexual jealousy. Ages 35 to 55, you're more likely to see people facing a personal crisis, evoking feelings of shame, embarrassment, rage, insecurity, and jealousy. So you mentioned jealousy earlier, and that is accurate. And then when we get 55 plus, we're more likely to see this kind of depressed, controlling spouse who murders an ill wife. And so then we get into like kind of the impacts of aging and chronic illnesses, and I'm no longer able to caretake this person. But again, it isn't just that, right? There's this kind of depression and controlling flair there also. And again, right, this is not like a universal thing. This is just a general.
It's numbers and statistics, right? And you got to view them in that lens. It'd be basically like saying if a basketball player shoots a 50% clip, it doesn't mean he's going to make one, next shot's going to miss, next shot's going to make. It's not how it works.
So then we get to this sort of distorted thinking, right? What kind of thoughts or what kind of statements do we hear from people who might be kind of going down this path or who have gone down this path? So where some of this research comes from is from this study of men who have killed their spouses. And then, of course, didn't kill themselves, right? Because we have the reporting thing. So take it for what it's worth to you personally. But I actually think there is something really important in language. And the way this study was done, it wasn't the researchers saying to these people, hey, how do you explain this? It was researchers going in and saying, hey, let's talk about this. And then we're going to analyze the language people use. So here are the patterns. There's some very black or white thinking that happens in that the perpetrators tended to view or describe themselves very positively and their spouse very negatively. Now, we can all take that to the nth degree, but a subtle form of that is, I'm the only one trying here. I did the best I could. She just hates my guts. She just screams at me. I don't know what she's so upset about. Right? There's no nuance in that description. And again, right, like there's some sussing out there of, sure, could someone be telling the truth? Sure. But actually, the vast majority of us, is somebody screaming at us, we're screaming back. And that's not getting reported now. So that tells us something, right? There's editing there.
100%.
Right? Then there's this sort of distancing from responsibility. This one is really important because, again, it can show up in these subtle ways. So with these violent offenders, right, the language that would get used of like, oh, and then she died. How? Just magically out of thin air, like heart attack?
Yeah, sudden cardiac arrest, bad timing.
Yeah, exactly. Or some of them would be like, I don't know. And then there was just like, there was a knife and then she was dead and I don't know. Oh, okay. And then she got a black eye and she was crying and I don't know. And then I was like out of the house. And this one I think is actually particularly important because as a community, there's a thing here of how do we talk about this afterwards? And sometimes the temptation is to engage in sort of similarly distancing language. And so instead of sort of placing the responsibility on the person who committed the act, we do this sort of distancing of they tragically passed away.
Not completely untrue.
Correct. It minimizes what it was. And I don't think, we're not talking about perpetrators anymore. I don't think people ever have ill intent when they're doing that, right? They're grappling with this really difficult thing and not knowing how to frame it or say it. But it is disrespectful to minimize the harm that is done to someone. And so that's something to look out for. And if we're going to look at kind of more subtle versions of this, or sort of like, how can we hold ourselves accountable to make sure we're not doing this in everyday life and maybe not in extreme scenarios? It's the difference between saying, hey, the bolt broke versus, yeah, I broke it.
Yeah, I was thinking of the car accident, fender bender situation, but that one's more fitting.
Yeah, it was a fender bender. Oops.
It's more fitting. Yeah, the bolt just broke. I put the wrench on it.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. It just broke.
I don't know what happened. It's Minnesota. It's shattered, man.
Right. And again, right, the vast majority of us can do that and it will never escalate here. But if we're talking about as a community, if we want to create a different culture, then we start doing this in these little kind of everyday ways. And then we're modeling it for other people. And then it flags when someone doesn't do it. So that's a piece of it. We also see a lot of kind of justification, deflections, and excuses, going back to this kind of study with violent offenders, right? And so this is the sort of like, she provoked me, right? A justification is like, well, she was having an affair, so she deserved it. No, still not a valid reason.
She insulted my mom.
Right, she insulted me. Yeah, she was going to leave with the kids and I was never going to see him again. No. And so it's just justifying. I did this because. Or it was a mistake. Okay, a mistake is tripping on someone's foot. A mistake is, I turned around and I didn't know you were there and I knocked the coffee out of your hands. Committing a violent act is not a mistake. It might be something you regret later, but then you say, I regret it. I wish I hadn't done that. I wish I had made a different choice. It's not a mistake. And people do this around affairs, if we want to kind of take it out of the violence area for a minute, and be like, oh, I made a mistake. And the kind of therapist comeback to that is, oh, so you tripped and fell and had intercourse with them? Like, how did that happen? It wasn't a mistake. You regret it and you wish you wouldn't have done it, but the doing it was actually very intentional. And then there's also this piece of like providing context to reduce guilt or responsibility, but they're kind of unrelated. Well, I had a really bad day at work and then they were harping on me and the kids were screaming and she hadn't picked up in 2 weeks and I just snapped. Well, actually, all that stuff is completely unrelated to the fact that you murdered your spouse. None of that is a valid reason, and why are you telling me that? And so when I think about like the sex crime things, the things I've sort of heard are, oh, well, no, it wasn't a sex crime, it was road rage. If you were ragefully screaming sexual obscenities at someone, do you think that's better? Correct. That isn't better. So there's that stuff, right? And then it's kind of the classic deny, minimize, dismiss. I didn't do that. It wasn't that big of a deal. You're just crazy. It's an overreaction. Sometimes that's the way episodes of domestic violence get explained away when someone asks about them. Oh, I was just stressed. Oh no, that didn't happen. I would never do that. You know me.
Picked the wrong day.
Right.
To the moon, Alice.
That's kind of our distorted thinking in a nutshell. All right, so let's kind of move towards what are some signs that somebody could be moving towards homicide, suicide? Because that's a question you had asked.
I understand, like that it's rough, but I think the more everyone's aware and again, kind of has a toolkit, in this case, maybe to see some flags and then maybe how to approach it, it could be just a net positive. It's going to stop anything. I mean, in large quantities, it's going to stop anything. I don't know. Maybe not. Probably not. But could it once?
Right. And actually, we don't get to know the impact because we can't measure crimes that didn't occur. And so there's this thing there when we look at kind of violence prevention or suicide prevention or DV prevention, where it's really hard to quantify it because it didn't happen. But wouldn't that be wonderful if it just didn't happen?
That would be great. Otherwise, we have to wait for a minority report where we get the preemptive. We can stop it before it happens because we know what's going to happen.
Correct. Yeah. Okay. So signs. Incidents of escalating DV. So when we talk about escalating, it would be increasing in frequency or intensity. They used to be just yelling. Now there's a physical component. This is going to sound terrible, but right, the physical intensity has increased. We've moved from maybe bruises to broken bones. We've moved from literally anything to strangulation.
We'll stick to spouses. I mean, when it comes to like that type of stuff, I think it's usually that, well, no matter what, it's more men than women, but it's pretty rare. Women are breaking the guy's limbs, but also with like child abuse, when it leads to the child being killed, it's the same freaking thing, that escalation.
Right. So escalation. Rehearsal of plan as an assault in the time before an incident. So to kind of put this into context, that would be like with firearms, right? The use of firearm in an assault that did not result in a homicide or suicide, but that could be a rehearsal. And that would also be an escalation.
So if you've ever been in an argument with your spouse and you've actually gone to your gun and maybe even thought about it you need to do something.
Right. What we actually need to do is restrict access to firearms and a good therapist and like some type of safety plan.
And if you're in a relationship where somebody in an argument went for their weapon,
you are at risk. You are at risk and you need to seek help to leave, because leaving it will also increase your risk.
I wanted to say you need to get out, but it's not that simple.
Correct. Seek help is the answer, right? There's a lot of good DV resources. They're very good at helping people develop plans to exit situations. The perpetrator seeking or maintaining control over the victim. So limiting access to friends or family, limiting access to money. And sometimes this is a bit more insidious than someone doesn't have access to a bank account. It can be something like, oh, well, I only have a $500 credit card. I don't know what's in our in our account. I don't have a debit card. I'm not allowed access to a credit card. Or my spouse gives me the credit card to go to the grocery store, and then I have to hand it over when I get home. So there's this financial piece, right? And then there can be a lot of monitoring, right? Showing up at places unannounced, GPS trackers. I mean, our phones are trackers in and of themselves. Calling or texting incessantly. When are you going to be home? When are you going to be home? You have to hurry up and come home.
The interrogations. Why did it take 45 minutes to go to the grocery store to get these 12 items? What were you doing? Where were you for real?
Right. Or, someone like, let's say you used to be able to hang out as friends and suddenly now that's changed. Right. Things like that.
That's a big one.
Right. Relationship characterized by possessiveness. Right. And so that's that very not allowed to talk to. You kind of describe that at an event, right? You kind of see some possessiveness there. Sometimes it's kind of statements like, no one will ever love you as much as I do. No one will ever put up with you like I do. No one would ever be as good to you as I am. I mean, we can all aspire to have that be true, but saying it has a different flair.
Right. That changes some dynamics a little bit.
Correct. Yeah. It's one thing to be like, oh, I really want to be a good partner for this person. And it's another to be like, right, I'm the only person who would ever love you. That's not nice anymore.
Yeah. I don't want to go off the rails at all, but to me, that almost seems somewhat supercharged by today's dating with online. It seems to me like that is supercharged.
Well, it is. And that's actually one of the issues in pop culture is some of this kind of possessive, controlling DVS stuff has been romanticized. And now it's this thing people aspire to. And no. Yeah, there's a whole other episode about pop culture and that.
Yeah, probably rhymes with red pill. Oh, wait, I said it. Oops.
I mean, there's part of that, but there's also more insidious stuff. The big thing that was talked about was the Twilight series or 50 Shades of Grey. Stuff that was massively popular with women, actually.
Kind of gets back to the porn episode where there is a big difference between fantasy.
Correct.
And reality. Right.
And can we even recognize that it's a problem? So there's that piece of it. Police contact or legal involvement, right? So if suddenly now this family has had the police called out to the house, or the neighbors heard screaming and the police were called, or there's an HRO or an OFP, right? Those are initials you're going to hear, or a DANCO. Those would all be major red flags that something's going on. I'm not allowed to see my kids. That's a red flag. Again, like I mentioned before, presence of firearms in the home just is a risk. So even just knowing that's important.
I'm not anti-swimming pool, but if you have a swimming pool, guess what? The chances of drowning just went up.
Correct, exactly.
There's just a reality to that.
Right, exactly. Again, use of any type of weapon in a couple or household dispute. So that isn't just firearms, knives, scissors, baseball bats, fill in the blank. Any type of weapon. And sometimes I think, especially, right, I'm going to know this stuff because of some of the work I do. Sometimes we don't anticipate things to be weapons that are. So whipping someone with an extension cord, okay, that's a problem. Things like that. Wire hangers are actually one that's really frequently used. That's a problem. Entrapment or isolation of a victim, right? So this is someone who's withdrawing or looks like they're withdrawing or withdrawn limited contact with friends, family. Maybe they used to be really socially active and now they're not, right? Clubs have sort of disappeared, things like that. Those would all be things of like, hey, I need to check on you. And that one is, we might not know in that scenario that someone is being isolated by someone else, right? But even that, like, so let's say we don't know, that could be a sign of depression. It could be a risk factor for suicide. It could be this risk factor for homicide, suicide. And so some of it is just, hey, this is weird. I'm going to check on it and try and figure it out and remain open to what it could be. And then also plan, intent, and means to commit a violent act or to commit suicide. This could include preparatory actions. So again, it might be similar to kind of our suicide episode, right? Buying life insurance, selling things off, some statements around like, hey, it's not going to matter anymore. Someone holding a gun to their head to see what it's like in front of a spouse. Rumination and rehearsal make something more likely to happen. So if someone is thinking a lot about like, oh, I could kill myself, I could kill my spouse, this is how I do it, we'd be better off, the world's a bad place, da 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 da. A sense of hopelessness and then also increasing anger or agitation.
It's sick to think about, but in a purely suicide situation, how many times has that gun been up against their head or in their mouth before they actually did it? And then in the case with the intimate partner homicide, how many times has that gun been up near their head while they're asleep? Like, they may not even know it, but this has been practiced.
Well, right. It's likely been practiced or premeditated in some way, right? There's kind of variability in what that looks like. And there is a very different flair to purely suicidal preparatory actions, which are very individualized and tend to be hidden, versus something that's more homicide, suicide, or in the context of DV, it's maybe done in front of a partner. There might be statements like, well, it would be your fault. You made me do this. I'm so miserable with you. Right? That has a totally different flavor.
Yeah, the whole you're making me do this or you made me do this or it would be your fault if I did this. If you're saying stuff like that, I hope red flags are going off and kind of like, I got to do something about this ASAP.
Right. If you're saying stuff like that, or if you've heard someone say that. Because statements like that aren't as uncommon as we think they are. And people can kind of allude to it of, well, you make me so miserable. I don't have any other choice. There's that piece of it too. So then, okay, let's unpin your question of what can we do? First and foremost, I kind of touched on this, but I'm going to say it again. Do not minimize, deny, or dismiss acts of violence. We can talk about people who have committed violent acts in a compassionate, non-black or white way while still naming that this was violent and not okay. It doesn't mean this person was a terrible person for their entire lives. It doesn't mean they were well or thinking clearly when they did this, right? Kind of by definition, someone who has killed someone is not doing well. But we really need to name it for what it is. And then ask. Straight up ask. Just like you kind of suspected with suicide or substance use, ask the perpetrator, ask the victim. And sometimes, depending on kind of how you know the person, right, we get to use our good judgment of how do we work into that conversation. And we can kind of think about, right, what are we asking? Are we asking if this person has ever been physically violent with you? Have they ever been sexually violent with you? I mean, this is a little bit of an advanced skill, but sometimes there's really intense physical violence we might ask about, like, did they ever hit you? Did they ever, right, things like that. Did they ever push you? Did they ever shake you? Did they ever block your exit? Things like that. Sexual violence, it might be like, well, do you ever have sex when you don't want to? A lot of women actually will not identify marital rape. Like, they will not call it that. If you ask them that, they would say no. It's a shock to them that they experienced that. But it's things like, well, I said no 7 times. He asked 8. He wasn't going to quit. I just gave up. I actually scrolled my phone the entire time. Or if I say no, he gives me the silent treatment for a day and a half.
Wait, that's not okay?
That's not okay. I know.
How about just a day?
Yeah, right. What's the line?
Yeah, wait, we got to set some boundaries here. What?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I'm also a certified sex therapist. This actually comes up a lot where people like, I was on my phone the whole time, or I read a book. If your spouse or any partner is reading a book while you're having sex with them, stop.
I just can't even imagine that. Like, that seems like something that would be in almost like a romantic comedy. It's not funny. Like, I don't want to imply that it's funny, but that is insane to me. Wow. And then the whole, I caved. So now it's not really rape or marital rape. Or he asked, it's been a couple days. If I say no, he ain't going to talk to me for the whole weekend.
Right. I weighed the risks and benefits. It is more painful to me to say no than to say yes, even though I don't want to. Yeah, no, that's a problem. Right. So we might ask some questions like that. And then also getting into the psychological stuff, it might pay to ask some specific questions. So think about name calling, screaming, swearing at, threatening, right? If you say, hey, is this person like psychologically, domestically violent? A lot of people are going to say no. But if you say like, well, does he ever call you names? Yeah. Right. And then you kind of run through the list. Does he ever threaten to take away the kids or to kill the dog? To harm the pet is actually a big one. There can be a lot of threats around harming pets.
I mean, cats I get, but dogs? I'm just kidding. That's insane. I just, wow. Wow.
Right. Threats to harm himself. You could even ask about that. So stuff like that. So you're going to ask really directly. And then you're going to ask the same questions to the person who might be doing it. Have you ever done this, right? Or, right, if you're wondering about emotions, like with your example of kind of the possessiveness of like, are you feeling jealous? What are you worried is going to happen?
It's easy to say, but they are an adult. They're autonomous. They're going to do what they're going to do. Now you can stack the odds in your favor that they wouldn't do that because, back to like the Gottman stuff, but they may still do that. And there's not much you're going to do about it.
Right. We don't actually get to control our spouses.
Right. That sucks that they could do that. But on the flip side, so could you.
Well, and, right, this is this sense of self thing. Just because they did X, it doesn't actually mean anything about you. Right? That's the threat thing that happens there of, if you do this, if you cheat on me, it means X, Y, Z about me. And sometimes there's something vulnerable there of it means I'm a terrible person. Or sometimes there's like, well, other people are going to think X, Y, Z about me. Right? And that's that autonomy piece. Other people's actions do not mean anything about you.
You drove her into the arms of somebody else. You weren't capable of satisfying her, so she had to go somewhere else. And no, it's nothing to do with that. Or very little.
So then there's this kind of added layer of, okay, so if you're asking and someone says yes, now what?
I mean, I guess my knee jerk is they need to get in touch with a domestic violent type of a entity, like maybe a women's shelter, or usually there's quite a few resources out there. And it seems like there's a number they could even call.
Yes, right. There's lots and lots of domestic violence resources, both for perpetrators and victims. If what you get someone is more depression or suicide based, right? A suicide hotline, therapist, right? Whatever someone hands you, you're going to encourage them to seek out resources. You might say like, hey, I'm going to text you this number. I really think you should do this. I think it would be so helpful. If you've ever been in therapy, that's a prime time to say like, hey, I actually used to struggle with anger and therapy was really helpful for me. I think it'd be great for you. Or so on and right, so on and so on. If there is what you think could be an imminent risk, and we're not operating on hopes here, we're operating on like, ooh, this person just says they thought about killing their spouse. What do you do? Call the police. That's what you do. You let them assess that and sort it out. Just like if someone said, yes, I'm actually thinking about killing myself and I have a plan and intent, you call 911. So that's what you do. And if this is a good friend, right, maybe then you follow up. Hey, have you done that yet? Hey, have you thought about that? I'm really worried about you. Right? If it's an acquaintance, I mean, I get it. Maybe you don't, but like you've done something at that point.
Sometimes something is just enough.
Well, sometimes it is. And sometimes that's all we get to do.
Yeah. That's a point I wouldn't have wanted to miss either. Yeah. It may not have worked. That was the opportunity you were given and you took it.
Correct. You tried. Yeah. What else can we do? We're going to assess for firearms. And this is the part where friends, especially male friends, are really important. When I'm dealing with someone who's suicidal or homicidal, I love male friends or brothers or fathers because those are the people who are frequently entrusted with firearms. We don't want to turn it over to the police or that person doesn't. Okay, fine. Who can they go to? Right? And so that's a thing you can offer. You know what? I'm really worried about you. Would you mind if I hung on to your firearms for a bit? I have a safe place. I have a key, blah, 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 blah. Right? That's a fabulous thing to do because we immediately decrease risk. And that's true suicide, homicide, I mean, fill in the blank.
And it's not decrease it a little.
Correct. It's decrease it a lot. That's a fabulous thing to do for people. And it's a fabulous thing that people can ask for. Hey, I'm really not feeling well. I'm kind of worried. Would you hang on to these for me? The answer is always yes. Right? You are going to go out and buy a gun safe that day and you are going to hang on to that person's firearms. Somebody asks you to do that. The answer is yes. Let me make that work.
Always.
With a key, right? So then we also kind of get into like the broader social stuff, right? What else can we do? Better DV laws, better mental health access, right? Encourage use, reduce stigma, and really know your local resources. Have like 2 of them in your head. They usually have most places will give you like a three-digit number, right? 911, 988.
I think 988 was the one I was kind of thinking of.
Yeah, that's the suicide hotline. I'm sure there's something for DV kind of depending on the area. And it's an easy thing to just program into your phone. Outside of that, there's sort of this accountability piece. How do we model accountability and kind of taking responsibility for our own bad behavior and make that the norm wherever we operate? So both for self and others. And so for ourselves, this is this piece of like, can men talk to other men about this? That's actually hugely impactful. And that's part of what's really effective in group therapy for perpetrators of violence is it's a group setting and it's men talking to other men. Right? We're also kind of modeling or demonstrating accountability. Like, hey, you just said that and that doesn't sit right with me.
And that ends up being hard to do, but you got to do it. And I'm not saying it ever gets easy, but the more you do it, it's a little easier to do. And it's really important to do.
Right, it is. And can we make it as normal as sort of asking questions professionally? So I do this as a therapist with other therapists all the time. I'll hear something and I'll be like, hey, can you help me understand why you did this? Right. And I know in the automotive field, like when people talk about diagnostics, that happens. Why did you think that? Okay, I understand that, but here's what I would think instead. And can we do it with these relational things too?
We should. And it would help with both. One, for people to ask, and then the people getting asked to not go immediately on the defensive either. I think that as the asker, that's usually what you're most fearful of is they go on the defensive, they're offended, now this thing just really blew up.
Yeah, and I do think there's a piece there of like, we can kind of frame it up for people of coming from a place of caring versus I think you're a bad person. Right? A lot of time that defensiveness can either come from this sort of like, I need to hide or protect the fact that I'm doing this and I don't want people to know. Or it's, oh my God, how could you think that about? Well, we're human and we're messy and we're complicated and I care about you. So I'm asking this question. If there is something going on, you're not going to feel better about yourself if you do this. And so I'm looking out for you by asking. And then there's just sort of the like speak up piece and kind of holding accountable. Hey, I really have a problem that this happened. Hey, that explanation doesn't actually sound very good to me. Hey, I still care about you and like this is hard for me to hear that you did this thing. And it's almost like making kind of accountability and responsibility part of the relationship. I'm not going to pretend like you didn't do this. I might not cut you out of my life entirely, but we need to talk about it.
Yep. Help me through this. Yep.
Right. And how can I support you in taking responsibility for this?
Yeah. And probably a little bit more than, I'm sorry, my bad.
Yeah, that's not taking responsibility.
I'll do better.
Well, yeah, right. And I think, even if we kind of lower the intensity for a second to like a DWI, a really good friend move if your friend gets a DWI is, you know what? I think we should stop meeting at the bar. Where can we meet instead?
Yes.
Great. We are not pretending like this didn't happen.
Yeah, that's a really good example.
So again, right, how can I help you do this better or different? If you're so angry at your spouse that you're screaming at her and calling her names, how about you come stay at my house instead?
But she burned my dinner.
We'll make you a dinner. Come stay at my house instead.
I'll show you how to cook so you can burn your own dinner.
Yeah, right. I have a Jack's Pizza. Here you go.
Yeah. I just kind of keep going back to when you said the dehumanizing portion. I hope that hits the listeners as hard as it hit me, because you start thinking about stuff that way, that just hits hard. That should make most people reassess a lot of word choices, because words have meaning. And unfortunately, if you say something long enough or often enough, it starts to become true. And it doesn't have to be about flat earth.
Right. It's a direct link, right? The way we say things, the way we think about things changes our brain structure. It changes our behavior. They're linked. You
rewired my brain again. Dang it.
If you want to stay the same, you should not talk to me.
I kind of want to continue to evolve.
That's good. That's a good instinct.
As a person, as an intellect, I want to evolve. I'm not saying it happens, but that's what I want.
That's the goal. It's a good goal. Yeah.
That's the goal. I have a target. We covered a lot. I don't know if there's much for a final thought, because I think it is very well covered. I'm really glad we did this. I hate, the circumstances leading to it, but I think there's a lot of really, really good info here and perspective, or offering of perspective, that hopefully resonates with everyone as much as it resonated with me. Yeah, I can't thank you enough for being on yet again.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Again, right, it's sad we have to do it, but I'm grateful for the invite.
So once again, this is Margaret Light, and she is the owner of Equilibrium Therapy Services, licensed for Minnesota. So if you're in the Minnesota area and need help pointing out your blind spots, heavily recommend. She's got a pretty good catalog built up just on this podcast. I think you've got a couple others out there.
I do. There's a couple others floating around, yeah.
And also a family counselor, individual counselor. You mentioned sex counseling, stuff like that. So, yeah. And thank you to our sponsors, NAPA Autotech Training, and thank you to the Aftermarket Radio Network. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you have any thoughts about this or other episodes, ideas for other episodes, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email at mattfonslowpodcast@gmail.com. And until next time, take care.
You've been listening to Matt Fonslow, diagnosing the aftermarket A to Z on the Aftermarket Radio Network. Follow Matt on your favorite listening app. He's very interested in what you have to say. Let him know what you'd like him to cover and come on the show. Matt is all for advancing the aftermarket. Find Matt Fonslow on social media and connect, or on aftermarketradionetwork.com.